Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Frank Cali, the quiet and modern leader who carried the legacy of the Gambino family into a new era. Known for his diplomacy, business sense, and calm nature, Cali believed in building power through respect rather than noise. To some, he was a symbol of the old ways surviving in a new world. To others, a man who understood that silence could be the strongest weapon of all. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. Now, close your eyes and imagine the streets of Staten Island at dusk, the quiet conversations in parked cars, and the modern empire of a man who lived by old traditions in changing times. Settle in, and let the story of Frank Cali guide you into the night. Frank Cali was born in New York in 1965 to a family with roots in Sicily, the island that taught him the value of patience. In the neighborhoods where he grew up, people remembered names, watched who you stood with, and measured respect in a handshake. The older folks never hurried. They set a pace for the younger ones by how they carried themselves. He absorbed that, keeping his head down, working, listening. Friends from those early years recalled a listener more than a talker, a steady presence who seemed older than his age. He learned that influence isn't a shout. It's a nod that others notice without knowing why. By the time he reached adulthood, he had one foot in Staten Island and the other in the world of his parents' birthplace, stitched together not just by memory but by marriage and business. He wed into a Sicilian family whose history ran deep on both sides of the ocean, a union that, according to law enforcement, strengthened ties between New York circles and Palermo clans. People who knew the families called it a bond of tradition as much as affection. Sunday dinners with long tables, elders speaking half in English, half in Sicilian, children darting in and out while the grown-ups lingered over espresso. Outwardly, it was a life like any other. There were homes to maintain, small companies to manage, contracts to chase, shipments to track, and the constant pressure of making sure everyone under the same roof was cared for. He kept away from clubs and headlines. He favored short conversations and simple routines, a presence so controlled that even neighbors would say later they barely knew anything about him. Journalists eventually learned his fuller name and the nickname that trailed him, Frankie Boy. Investigators said he rose through the ranks of a well-known New York crime family that had been changing shape since the loud era of the late 20th century gave way to a quieter, more careful model. After decades of arrests and trials that had taken down a previous generation, a different approach took hold. Less flash, fewer big meetings, more discipline. The people credited with steering that shift were men with Sicilian roots who had weathered storms by avoiding attention. They modeled a style built on business-like calm. He fit that mold. He walked softly, stayed off cameras, and kept his name out of publicity unless someone else dragged it there. Public records show that he had legitimate ventures around food distribution and real estate, companies that gave him a daily routine and a paper trail. There were warehouses where pallets sat stacked shoulder high, forklifts whining as crews moved goods, clipboards and invoices that looked like any other small enterprise trying to keep deliveries on time. But according to prosecutors, he also became a bridge between New York's organization and families in Palermo, an ambassador of sorts, fluent in the language of both places. This wasn't the swaggering image from films. It was subtler. Visits managed with care, conversations kept short, phones rarely used or used in ways that left no trail. Agents who followed him said he was disciplined, no unnecessary meetings, no public scenes, no careless habits. He liked a stable home and a predictable calendar. He remained difficult to record and harder to lure into traps that had caught others. The first time his name firmly appeared in court filings that stuck came in 2008, when a sweeping case swept up dozens tied by prosecutors to the same New York family. That crackdown, widely reported at the time, reached into meetings and phone calls, and prosecutors said it also exposed an effort to collect money by intimidation. He was charged with extortion conspiracy. The prosecution's picture was classic. A dispute over money, the expectation that a debt would be paid because certain people asked, and the weight of implied consequences if it wasn't. Rather than fight it through trial, he took a plea on the conspiracy count. He did time about a year and a half and came out in 2009. There was no violent charge in that case, and he did not contest the government's account in court. It was the most concrete, documented crime on his record. A felony extortion, conspiracy conviction that he accepted, and a sentence he served. Anything else people claimed about him belongs to the domain of surveillance reports and news accounts, since he wasn't convicted of other crimes in U.S. courts. After his release, he slid back into his low-profile existence as if nothing had changed. Neighbors still saw the same routines: school runs, errands, visits to family businesses, a man who waved to familiar faces and kept moving. Yet, according to federal agents and organized crime detectives, his influence only grew. The leadership of the organization he was tied to had become more reserved. A Sicilian-born figure assumed the official top spot in the early 2010 seconds, and several law enforcement briefings suggested that our subject was part of the closest inner circle, sometimes described as a trusted lieutenant or acting figure when needed. Those were attributions by authorities. They weren't legal findings. But the consensus in investigative circles was that he had become essential, an arbiter who could cool tempers, line up agreements, and reinforce the steady, businesslike style that defined that period. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Italian police were trying to measure whether exiled Palermo families were regaining ground. A 2015 operation in Sicily, widely covered by European and American media, included wiretaps and reports claiming that a new bridge had formed between Palermo clans and their New York relatives. His name surfaced in those papers as a point of contact, a respected figure who could smooth communication and keep cross-ocean disputes from boiling over. He was not charged in that Italian case. The portrait, pieced together from law enforcement statements and court summaries, was consistent. A man who preferred not to be photographed, who rarely raised his voice, and who was said to hold a decisive vote without needing to show it. In day-to-day life, he seemed almost ordinary, more so than people expected when they later learned who he was. He liked family gatherings that felt routine, the kind where kids shouted from upstairs and adults talked softly in the kitchen. He protected privacy not as a flair, but as a principle. He didn't cultivate a circle of hangers-on. He invested time in legitimate business because it kept him grounded and provided cover from speculation. If someone asked what he did for a living, he could point to an office, a warehouse, a line on a corporate registry. It was harder to explain the rest, and he rarely tried, leaving reporters and agents to stitch together the outline on their own. Authorities said that under the surface, he remained an enforcer of old rhythms. The practice of collecting money owed, the quiet pressure that kept certain contractors in line, the circuits of gambling and loans that produced steady income streams for whoever controlled them. Those descriptions appeared in indictments against associates, in surveillance affidavits, and in the analyses of organized crime units. To be precise, much of it was allegation rather than courtroom proof against him personally. The exception again was the 2008 extortion conspiracy conviction that put him behind bars for months and on supervised release afterward. Still, when detectives mapped power inside the organization, they kept placing his name near the middle of the web. He functioned, they said, like a diplomat, a fixer, a logistics man who could manage people who didn't like each other without making enemies of either side. That kind of role rarely makes headlines, but it shapes outcomes. He didn't forget Sicily. Family ties kept him connected to Palermo even when he stayed stateside. Weddings and funerals, holiday calls, business conversations that doubled as family check-ins. These were the threads that held together a network built on kinship as much as profit. Italian investigators listened to men in Palermo speak about the Americans as brothers and cousins, partners to respect, not ghosts from an older era. In that world, handshakes meant obligations, and silence was currency. He understood that language completely. If Palermo needed New York, or New York needed Palermo, he was, according to multiple law enforcement accounts, one of the first calls. His temperament kept him safe for a long time. He avoided the trappings that had sunk louder figures. No flashy cars in his name, no callous jokes in restaurants that reached the wrong ears, no reckless side deals that undercut alliances. He kept messages short. He chose meeting spots that looked like errands. He used the front seat of a car like an office when necessary, a place where someone could talk without leaving a paper trail. He believed that staying out of the news was as important as any rule. Investigators who spent years trailing men like him grudgingly respected that restraint. It made their jobs harder. As the 2010 seconds moved forward, Media outlets began calling him the boss of his organization, or at least its acting leader. Those headlines relied on anonymous law enforcement sources and the judgments of veteran reporters who tracked changes in leadership. No court ever adjudicated an official boss status for him, and he did not stand trial on a leadership charge. But the picture painted by those who follow organized crime for a living placed him at the top of a quieter, leaner hierarchy. He was said to favor consensus over bullying, financial sense over vanity, and a strictly enforced boundary between family life and business. People in his orbit learned that failing to respect that boundary was a quick way to lose standing. He kept his home base on Staten Island, in a neighborhood where lawns are trimmed and dogs are walked after dinner. It was an ordinary setting for a man described as anything but ordinary by police and the press. He greeted neighbors and moved along. He took calls on the go, and if a conversation grew tense, he switched to calmer tones rather than raising his voice. He liked to be home for dinner when he could. He knew that time moves fast, that children grow up before you see it happening. For all the weight his name carried in investigative files, his day looked like any working parent's. Hours spent juggling obligations, dealing with people, and trying to keep everything balanced. The difference was who those people were and what some of those obligations meant. The story of his life isn't a set of movie scenes. It's a steady accumulation of choices in rooms without cameras. It's the call you don't return, the meeting you refuse, the debt you do collect because not collecting would ripple out in ways you can't afford. The one documented crime that put him in federal custody was extortion conspiracy in 2008, and he served that sentence. Beyond that, what he was, according to prosecutors, detectives, and journalists, was a quiet leader of a legacy institution that adapted to survive. He preferred diplomacy to drama. He took pride in being underestimated. He embodied a paradox. The more the world learned his name, the more he tried to disappear behind it. On certain nights, as the city settled and the sky turned the color of slate, he would step onto his porch and look down the street like any other homeowner, as if to make sure everything around him stayed calm. He had spent years keeping tempers low and business steady. He had stitched together two worlds and tried to keep them from tearing. The cost of that balance, the decisions that shaped it, and the final turn his life took would become clear in time. For now, picture the porch light, the closed door behind him, and the stillness he worked so hard to preserve. Before a city wakes, corridors of influence hum in a low register. Doors open and close with barely a click. A late ferry slides across the bay. A diner opens early, steam rising off coffee that no one drinks too fast. In these hours, people who prefer quiet solve problems with 5 words, a pause, and a look that ends arguments without making one. He thrived in those margins. He valued tone over volume, patience over speed, steadiness over bravado. That style didn't make him famous. It made him effective. He understood that reputations in his world were built not on speeches or spectacle, but on routine. Show up on time, keep your word, avoid mistakes that attract heat. He turned that into a daily craft. Neighbors saw an attentive father and a careful homeowner. Investigators saw a coordinator who rarely left a footprint. Both portraits could be true at once. He built his adult life around 2 orbits: Staten Island, where he kept home, and Palermo, where bloodlines and old friendships reached across an ocean. Marriage deepened those ties. He wed into the Inzerillo clan from Palermo, a family whose history had intertwined with New York cousins for decades. That union, reported widely in both Italian and American press, placed him at a junction where tradition and business overlapped. Sunday meals stretched long, elders mixing languages without thinking about it. Younger relatives absorbed the mannerisms of people who had survived hard seasons by staying calm. He was one of those quiet pupils. He treated respect like currency and privacy like a shield. Workdays looked ordinary from the outside. He invested time in legitimate ventures, imported foods, distribution, property holdings that gave him an office, invoices, co-workers who punched a clock, and a reason to be on the phone with suppliers. Forklifts beeped across warehouse floors. Bills of lading moved from desk to desk. Trucks queued at loading docks where sunburned drivers swapped jokes and paperwork. In a city that runs on logistics, that lane offered cover and credibility. It also suited him. He liked systems, timetables, and the feeling that everything had a place. Detectives and prosecutors, though, believed he did more than move goods. Through surveillance affidavits and grand jury presentations, They described him as a liaison between New York figures and Sicilian counterparts, a man trusted to keep tempers low and plans aligned. Those accounts, repeated in numerous news stories, cast him as a broker rather than a showman, someone who could sit with older bosses and young earners, translate expectations, and send each side back to work with their dignity intact. In that role, he avoided the mistakes that had toppled louder names. He didn't overuse phones. He didn't chase nightclubs. He didn't travel with entourages. He left as light a trace as possible. His first major appearance in a federal case file arrived in 2008, a sweeping operation familiar to readers of crime coverage for the number of arrests and the inclusion of several senior figures named him in a conspiracy to commit extortion. Prosecutors said he took part in a classic pressure campaign around a business dispute. Money expected, money not paid, messages delivered that made the expectation clear. No violent count accompanied that charge in his case. He chose to plead guilty to the conspiracy. A judge sentenced him to a term that kept him in federal custody for roughly 16 months, followed by supervised release. That conviction stands as the documented crime for which he served time in the United States. It sits in the public record, precise and unembellished, unlike the wider swirl of allegations that never reached a jury in his own name. When he came home in 2009, he returned to schedule and understatement. Friends noticed he picked up right where he left off. Family first, business second, everything else treated with caution. Law enforcement briefings in the years that followed, however, placed him deeper inside the hierarchy of the organization long associated with his surname's world. In 2011, a Sicilian-born figure stepped into the top seat, according to the FBI and seasoned reporters. Those same sources often listed our subject on short rosters of influential lieutenants, sometimes as a captain, sometimes as an acting figure when travel or health kept others away, sometimes simply as the person you had to consult if you wanted an answer that stuck. Courts never adjudicated a leadership title for him, and he was not convicted of running the organization. Yet the consensus among investigators held that he carried far more sway than his modest public footprint suggested. Across the Atlantic, Italian authorities launched probes into a possible resurgence of Palermo's exiled families. In a 2014-2015 investigation, often referred to by journalists as a new bridge between Palermo and New York, prosecutors in Sicily released transcripts and summaries portraying him as a point of contact, a dependable voice who could validate decisions or calm rivalries. Those records, which made headlines in Italy and the US, described him as an ambassador of sorts, a word that fit the American portrait as well. He was not charged by Italian courts in that operation. The picture that emerged, stitched together from official statements and court filings abroad, reinforced the same idea. He operated by consensus, kept emotions low, and honored bonds that reached back generations. Daily life never drifted far from normal. He drove the same routes, waved to the same neighbors, kept appointments on a short mental list. He valued dinners that started on time, holiday rituals that didn't change, mundane errands that formed a kind of ballast. People who visited his home later remembered a tidy space, a preference for simple clothes, an absence of anything that looked like a trophy. For a man often linked by reporters to a notorious banner, he went out of his way to look like any other middle-aged New Yorker who worried about the price of repairs and whether the trash would be picked up on schedule. The quieter portrait coexisted with the one drawn by squads who track organized crime as a career. Those detectives described long-standing revenue streams that rarely make headlines but don't go away. Loans extended at predatory rates to struggling shop owners, neighborhood gambling that ran on trust and settled in cash, pressure placed on contractors who wanted their projects to move without headaches, and the constant skimming opportunities that appear wherever freight moves and bills are signed. In their telling, he oversaw pieces of those circuits or mediated disputes when other men tangled over territory or percentages. These were allegations in investigative documents and interviews, not findings of guilt against him personally, and he was not convicted of those wider claims. Still, the same names kept appearing in intelligence logs, and his was often near the top. His approach to conflict resolution became a calling card. Rather than issue threats, he would insist on a sit-down. He preferred to ask 3 questions and let a person talk themselves into a solution. Younger men in the orbit learned a formula just by watching. Keep your voice down. Hear both sides. Do the math. and leave people a path to save face. That habit saved time and avoided the sort of theatrics that draw surveillance and, eventually, charges. It also built him a kind of quiet capital. If he said a dispute was closed, it was closed. If he said a collection could wait, it waited. If he signaled that a meeting should end, chairs scraped back and the room emptied. You didn't need to see a crown to recognize authority. He carried that authority without vanity. When reporters began to float headlines that called him the head of his organization, he didn't give interviews or seek to shape the narrative. Law enforcement sources, usually unnamed, often consistent, told journalists that the balance had shifted his way, especially after leaders from an older era died, retired, or faced long sentences. Analysts saw a pattern, a Sicilian-leaning leadership group that prized discretion, financial sense, and transatlantic harmony. In that model, he was a centerpiece, yet no indictment labeled him boss, and no courtroom declared it. The distance between rumor and legal proof remained part of his story. The home front stayed deliberately unremarkable. Weeknights meant familiar faces around the table, neighborhood walks, the kind of suburban rhythms that insulate kids from headlines. He took pride in being present. He helped with what needed doing and avoided schedules that kept him out late without necessity. To acquaintances, he came off polite, even gentle. To investigators, he was a strategist who understood how to minimize exposure. To both, he was difficult to pin down in a soundbite. That was by design. He treated Sicily like a second home he could visit without leaving New York. Calls on holidays, handshakes at weddings, condolences on the phone at odd hours, these gestures kept relationships alive. Italian recordings picked up elders speaking of American relatives with fondness and expectation, using family words more than business ones. Within that language lay obligations that predated him and would outlast him. He took them seriously. If Palermo needed a favor, he listened. If New York needed Palermo to pull back, he made the case without insulting anyone. That ability to say no without making enemies earned him respect that money can't buy. There is a temptation, when sketching a life in this world, to chase movie details. He resisted those cliches in practice, and this account resists them in telling. He broke the law in 2008 by pleading to extortion conspiracy. He served his sentence and returned home. Beyond that, officials attributed to him a portfolio of clandestine work that he never publicly acknowledged and that never brought additional convictions in his name. What can be said with confidence is that he emphasized order, valued alliances with Palermo families, and shaped a leadership style that made fewer headlines while assuming more control. It was the opposite of spectacle, a long exercise in restraint. By the mid-2010 seconds, his name, rarely spoken loudly in earlier years, had become unavoidable in stories about the evolution of the organization. Some longtime observers said he operated as a stabilizer after turbulent decades, less interested in turf wars than in steady income and keeping peace with groups that had once been rivals. He leaned on basic rules: no improvisation with outsiders, no impulsive trips, no arrogance. Younger associates learned to leave their egos at the door and let results speak. Older ones appreciated that bills got paid and that no one courted disaster. That discipline extended to technology. He favored brevity in messages, in-person talks when necessary, and habits that looked boring on purpose. Agents who tracked him joked to each other that he seemed allergic to microphones. That made gathering evidence hard and added to his mystique. They could map his circles, list his companies, note his family ties, but they struggled to catch him saying something careless. The gaps between what they believed and what they could prove frustrated careers built on closing those gaps. Meanwhile, his businesses kept moving. A pallet here, a lease there, an investment in a small property that needed work. These tangible tasks kept his days full and provided explanations for his travel. He could talk about shipping delays or tenant issues without thinking twice. That duality was the point. If you asked what he did, he could answer plainly and truthfully. If incompletely, he liked answers that ended questions. Information about him wasn't easy to gather even for those who tried. He avoided photographs. He skipped events where cameras were likely. He left few traces online. When his name appeared in the press, it often came from law enforcement leaks or court documents rather than from anything he said or did publicly. That reticence wasn't a quirk. It was a survival plan. He'd watched men crumble under a tension they thought they could handle. He wasn't going to repeat that mistake. People who dealt with him on the legitimate side described a calm manager who returned calls, honored schedules, and expected competence. He didn't rant or belittle staff. He preferred quick check-ins to long meetings. Those traits made him likable, which in turn made it harder for outsiders to connect the man at the warehouse to the figure described in federal memos. That disconnect protected him. It also made his story more complicated than a tale of a villain or a hero. He neither sought the public eye nor retreated from responsibility. He kept going, one quiet day after another. The paradox of his life deepened with time. As headlines began to hint at his standing, his routines grew even more ordinary. As investigators put him in the center of charts, he chose the edges of rooms. As families in Palermo regained confidence, he focused on reducing friction rather than exploiting it. His guiding belief held, control comes from calm. That belief kept him in place through years when other names rose and fell. It also gave his final chapter a sense of inevitability, not because he courted it, but because anyone whose name gathers weight, a name whispered in both New York and Palermo, in precinct houses and parish halls, eventually collides with forces beyond their control. He didn't rush toward that collision. He did what he always did, drove familiar streets, answered calls when it made sense, declined the ones that didn't, and kept life as plain as possible. The porch light clicked on at dusk. The same front steps creaked under his shoes. The mailbox took bills and junk flyers like every other mailbox on the block. From the curb, it looked like nothing at all. Inside that ordinary frame, however, decisions still flowed through him who should talk to whom, when a problem needed attention, how to keep peace with allies overseas without upsetting balances at home. Those choices, repeated over months and years, defined him more than any headline could. Before the decade closed, the quiet life he worked to preserve would meet a public moment no one around him wanted. To understand how that moment arrived, you have to hold both pictures at once. The attentive family man who went out of his way to appear ordinary, and the discreet power broker, whom officials saw as essential to the old institution's new shape. He lived as both, every day, in a city that rewards invisibility right up until the instant it can't. Some endings are loud. Most important ones arrive like a change in air pressure. A door easing shut. A pause in a conversation that tells you everything. In the city's softer hours, when the sky hasn't picked a color yet, and the streets hum at half volume, you notice what's steady. A person who keeps the same set of habits, keeps calls short, keeps promises. You don't see the gears, only the rhythm. He built his life around that rhythm. He never called attention to himself and didn't try to win arguments with noise. He valued the kind of patience that makes others reconsider, the kind of control that doesn't look like control at all. That style won him respect in places where reputations usually get made with headlines. He didn't want headlines. He wanted results that left no fingerprints. By the early 2000s, the organization tied to his name had been through decades of public trials and private reckonings. Old hierarchies had been thinned by indictments, age, and the passage of time. The people who survived did so by tightening their circle, reducing risk, and leaning on trusted ties to Sicily. He fit that turn perfectly. Reporters and agents who watched that world said he sat near men who preferred quiet to swagger, business to spectacle. He was not the kind who tried to reinvent anything. He was the kind who made established systems work smoothly, collections handled without drama, disputes settled before they turned into feuds, messages carried with respect. He thought of his day like logistics. Move information from one point to another without damage, keep routes short, avoid detours that invite attention. Marriage anchored him to Palermo in a way that mattered. He wed into the Inzerillo family, a name that meant history on both sides of the ocean. That bond wasn't just about affection, it was also about lineage, obligation, and shared memory. Weddings, holidays, and funerals stitched together New York and Sicily, and his seat at those gatherings told people who he was without introduction. Through that union, he became kin to figures whose surnames had weight in both Palermo and New York. He didn't speak about it, he didn't have to. In that world, kinship is a shorthand everyone understands. His legitimate life was tangible and dull in the best way. Food distribution, warehousing, Property holdings. There were addresses you could find, employees who clocked in, invoices that moved across desks with coffee rings and staple holes. He liked that reality because it gave him a reason to be busy that anyone could verify. It also trained his mind to think in schedules and flows. What's late? What's ready? What needs to be fixed before it breaks? Friends from those years described a man who expected order, who could be counted on to return a call, who was pleasant without being chatty. He didn't waste words or let a meeting spin. Keep it short. Make it clear. Leave no confusion behind. Investigators, meanwhile, painted a parallel portrait. In their memos and press briefings, they called him a diplomatic presence, a problem solver trusted by people who didn't trust easily. They linked him to a Sicilian wing, a phrase that showed up in articles and off-the-record conversations, meaning a leadership style rooted in Palermo's long memory and careful manners. They said he became a kind of translator between generations and between countries, a person who could explain New York's needs to Palermo elders and bring back guidance that calmed tempers. Those were allegations and assessments, not findings from a trial in his name, but they stayed consistent over years of reporting. There is one charge you can point to without caveats. In 2008, a broad federal sweep reached dozens of people connected by prosecutors to the same New York organization. He was charged with extortion conspiracy tied to a business dispute. The picture, according to the government's filings, was straightforward. Money demanded, money not paid, pressure applied to make the payment happen. He did not stand accused of violence in that case. He pleaded guilty to the conspiracy count, received a sentence of about 16 months, and returned home in 2009. That conviction is clear and documented. Many other claims about his influence and responsibilities come from surveillance summaries, interviews with investigators, and journalist sourcing rather than from judgments by a jury. After his release, he resumed the same pace neighbors knew. School routines, errands, work days that ended at a sensible hour. Law enforcement bulletins, however, began to place him closer to the center of the map. In 2011, a Sicilian-born figure widely identified by authorities as the new official head took charge. Analysts who follow organized crime said our subject was part of that leader's tight circle, sometimes described as a captain, sometimes as an acting hand when the top seat needed cover, sometimes simply as the person who could deliver a yes or a no that people accepted. Courts never certified a title for him. But in precinct houses and newsrooms, the consensus grew. He was indispensable and preferred it that way. Across the Atlantic, Italian police pursued their own lines. In 2015, a series of arrests and wiretaps in Palermo led prosecutors there to claim that a new bridge had formed between Sicily and New York. Names and snippets from those recordings hit the papers. His surfaced in the role of a contact someone Palermo figures trusted to confirm arrangements or cool rivalries. He wasn't charged in Italy during that operation, but the way people talked about him matched the American portrait. He was dependable, polite, and effective, a person who viewed stability as a goal in itself. That stability showed up at home too. Dinner on time. Focus on family. A front walk swept clean. When acquaintances later learned his fuller reputation, they struggled to square it with the neighbor who helped carry groceries or made small talk about a sports score. He kept anything dramatic out of view by design. He'd watched what happened to men who believed their own publicity. He favored invisibility instead. On the enforcement side, detectives described familiar revenue streams that authorities have tracked for generations. Interest charged at rates that trap borrowers, neighborhood gambling that depends on trust and closes disputes without paperwork, pressure on contractors who want smoother projects, quiet influence where cargo moves. In debriefings and affidavits, names came and went. His stayed in the middle. Agents said he mediated turf questions and percentages, ensuring that arguments ended before anyone did something rash. Those accounts, again, were attributions by authorities rather than convictions against him personally. The exception remained that 2008 conspiracy case, which he admitted and served. As the mid-2010 seconds unfolded, funerals marked the passing of an older generation. One of the most prominent was in 2017, when a revered relative by marriage, a veteran of the Cherry Hill Circle, died. That loss shaped succession conversations informally. Observers wrote that his influence increased in the years after. Not because he made a grab for it, but because he was the person others turned to when they needed someone steady. Veterans trusted him. Younger men studying the new rules understood that he kept the peace and kept the money flowing. The word boss appeared in headlines with more confidence, almost always sourced to investigators rather than to court filings. He stayed quiet while others tried to label him. His habits didn't change. He kept technology at arm's length, avoided long phone calls, preferred short in-person meetings that looked like errands, and refused to be photographed when he could help it. He structured days around family and work, not around gatherings that filled rooms with talk. People who wanted to speak with him learned to make their point quickly and leave. He didn't enjoy gossip. He enjoyed clear results. In that time, he was also careful with international ties. Palermitani, who spoke on wiretaps, described Americans with affection and introduced family terms into business conversations. He honored that tone. He understood that pride can complicate simple matters, and he took pride in removing complications. If Palermo needed a delay so that elders could weigh in, he allowed it. If New York needed to accelerate something, he made the case without offense. That balancing act gave him value that couldn't be replaced easily. He approached money the way he approached everything, methodically. Legitimate operations paid taxes and dealt with inspectors, and he didn't hide from that. The other side of the ledger, what investigators called shadow income, was handled with caution. He didn't take foolish risks. He didn't let new people jump steps. He stuck to a pace that kept law enforcement frustrated, because it avoided the rash moments that produce wiretap gold. Agents who chased him spoke of negative space evidence, the calls he didn't make, the rooms he didn't enter, the meetings he insisted on keeping small. He was good at not being where trouble happened. By then, reporters had begun noting something else. The organization's shift under leaders like him toward a less theatrical model. No grand social clubs, fewer large sit-downs, more attention to small, steady revenue, and less tolerance for drama. He liked that. It matched his personality. The point wasn't to be feared. The point was to be obeyed without argument. If a contractor was late, he wanted a reason, not a scene. If two earners tangled, he worked out a split that both could accept. If someone went off script, he cut them out rather than escalating. His authority lived in the way rooms quieted when he entered, not in stories told later at bars. The portrait you get from all this is a life composed of routines with consequences. He committed a documented crime in 2008, accepted punishment, and came back. He then navigated an old institution through a new era by emphasizing restraint, alliances, and a transatlantic rapport that turned old rivalries into manageable partnerships. None of that made for movie moments. It made for a long run without additional convictions and a reputation based on how often he could prevent situations from turning ugly. But history rarely lets even the careful write all the rules. As the decade drew toward its end, attention he had avoided began to find him anyway. Detectives mapped his associates with more certainty. Reporters asked more pointed questions. People who resented his pragmatism either because they lost out on a decision or because they preferred a louder style grumbled. He didn't respond. He did what he always did. Set schedules, kept calls short, stuck to predictable routes, and invested time and family. He treated patience like armor. That armor held until a night that wasn't supposed to be different from any other. The facts that followed would be reconstructed from cameras, statements, and an arrest that left investigators as surprised as anyone. The person charged in that case wasn't an old rival, not a figure from Palermo, not a name from the organization's long list of opponents. It was a young man with no history in that world. Someone who, according to police, became fixated on a personal grievance that spiraled. The case would later include claims in court about strange beliefs and confused motives, a story that spun away from the organized calculus that had governed his life. Before that turn, he remained the same steady presence who spent years turning down volume in rooms prone to shouting. He had built credibility carefully, a conviction served without complaint, and afterward lived without gloating, a leadership style based on courtesy and boundaries, a household that looked like any other family's. He was the person older men sent for when pride needed cooling, and younger ones watched for cues on how to behave. He stitched together two coasts of the same sea, without calling attention to the seam. You can measure a life like his not just in dates and charges, but in the absence of spectacle. He avoided the intoxication of being recognized. He kept allies close without building a coterie. He learned from elders who survived by remembering that the loudest man in the room tends to be the first one let out in cuffs. He let others argue about titles while he focused on outcomes. In a city that insists on speed, he practiced slowness. In a business that often confuses greed with courage, he practiced caution. Each choice purchased another quiet day. That pattern, the slow, careful routine, creates its own kind of suspense. People like that look invulnerable because nothing seems to stick. Yet the very invisibility that protects can isolate. When something unexpected approaches from outside the world you know, the skills that solved everything else may not apply. He wasn't reckless, and he didn't relax his rules. He simply faced a situation where rules and history couldn't predict what came next. The irony is hard to miss. A career built on anticipating moves and managing outcomes undone by something no one inside his universe would have predicted. In the months leading to that moment, nothing on the surface signaled a change. The same porch light, the same careful drive through quiet streets, the same phone discipline honed over decades. He remained on civil terms with neighbors, courteous in shops, quick with a nod but not with extra talk. People in his orbit kept working. Palermo maintained its cadence of calls and visits. Investigators continued to watch. Reporters kept writing in the conditional, believed to be, suspected of, thought to hold. He allowed the conditionals to stand. He understood that certainty in print invites attention he never wanted. When the break finally came, it didn't make sense to anyone at first. The headlines compared the moment to older tragedies because the city reaches for familiar frames. But the details pointed somewhere else. A suspect with no place in old feuds. A collision of personal obsession and public notoriety. A crime that said more about the chaos of modern life than about the codified disputes of an older underworld. He had spent years building a bridge between New York and Palermo to prevent hot blood from boiling over. He never imagined the most unpredictable crossing would come from a person with no standing in either place. That's the piece most people remember now, the jarring mismatch between a life of deliberate calm and a final turn that arrived from far outside his rules. But a fuller memory needs both halves. It needs the quiet man who spoke softly, kept a family out of the spotlight, and accepted a federal conviction without drama. It needs the careful broker who, according to authorities and journalists, helped shape a reserved, modernized leadership built on Sicilian ties and restraint, without adding another conviction to his name after 2008. It needs the picture of someone who made order in a corner of the world famous for disorder. Only then does the shock of what followed make sense. In those last calm days, when twilight settled across sidewalks and the neighborhood eased into routine, he stood where he always stood between two cultures, between family life and a structure that demanded constant attention, between the past's loud legends and a future he hoped would stay quiet. He didn't chase a legacy. He tried to keep the peace. He believed that being underestimated was the safest place to be. For a long time, he was right. In any city, there are nights that pass like water, and then there are nights that redraw a street you thought you knew. A porch bulb brightens as the sun slips away. Tires whisper over asphalt. Somewhere, a dog barks once and goes quiet. The quiet feels earned, like a promise that tomorrow will look the same. You pour a glass of water, check a lock you always check, and think about nothing in particular. Routine holds the neighborhood together. It held his life together too, right up until the evening when the ordinary frame couldn't contain what was coming. He had built his world from small, repeatable habits, family first, business handled without theater, conversations kept to the length of a parking meter. People mistook that restraint for passivity. It was discipline. By staying predictable, he stayed safe. The work that flowed through him, some of it on paper, some of it known mainly to investigators and reporters, depended on steadiness. He'd served his federal sentence years earlier and returned home determined to keep both sides of his life orderly. There were invoices to sign, and kids to ferry, and relatives to call in Palermo at hours that fit 2 time zones. He kept his shoulders level under all of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't leave a trail of bravado. The city around him had changed since the loud years when television trucks parked outside courthouses. The organization tied to his name changed with it. Investigations and age had thinned old ranks, and a quieter model took hold: fewer gatherings, fewer phones, more attention to dignity and practical results. He was central to that shift, according to law enforcement briefings, and the reporting that followed those briefings. He never confirmed it. He never chased the title. He let other people talk while he kept the calendar moving. In the early months of 2019, nothing in his routine suggested a break. He kept business calls brief and avoided places that drew cameras. He was polite with neighbors, careful at intersections, and home when he said he'd be. People who tracked him professionally noted the same patterns and grumbled privately that he refused to repeat the mistakes of louder men. He offered them no easy openings. He had long believed that danger usually comes from within a circle, from grievances that calcify and boil. He had spent years preventing exactly that. What he could not anticipate was danger that didn't follow the old patterns at all. The evening arrived without warning. Reports later assembled by police and the press described a sequence at his home. A vehicle, a brief collision that drew him outside, an exchange that lasted moments, and then a sudden eruption that ended the life he had worked so hard to keep ordinary. Neighbors called for help. The street that favored quiet filled with sirens and blue lights. He was taken to a hospital and did not survive. No graphic details were necessary to understand the weight of what happened. A life defined by restraint met an ending that broke the rules he had lived by. At first, the city reached for its familiar myths. A leader tied by authorities to a storied New York organization was gone. Headlines summoned the ghosts of earlier decades. Detectives, though, kept their focus narrow. They studied surveillance footage, canvassed the block, traced vehicles, and followed the chain of small evidentiary steps that modern investigations rely on. Days later, an arrest came miles away in New Jersey. The suspect was not an older rival, not a name out of Palermo, not even someone long whispered about in the precincts that monitor organized crime. He was a young man from Staten Island with no place in that old world at all. His name, widely reported, was Anthony Camello. Prosecutors charged him with murder. Early speculation in the press recycled neighborhood rumors about a possible romantic dispute. As the case unfolded, his lawyer introduced a very different story in court. Claims of delusional beliefs and internet-driven conspiracies, ideas far removed from the usual motives attached to scenes like this. He was portrayed by his defense as someone adrift in a fog of invented enemies and imagined missions. He appeared in court with scribbles on his hand that were interpreted as nods to fringe theories. Competency evaluations followed. Proceedings moved slowly as the court weighed his mental state. Through it all, he remained in custody awaiting a resolution that did not come quickly. The picture that emerged bore little resemblance to the typical script of underworld conflict. Law enforcement officials took care to say so. They told reporters there was no sign of a brewing feud inside the organization or across the ocean. Italian partners said the same. The shock rippled through New York anyway, because it had been decades since a figure of his stature described by authorities and analysts as a leader or acting leader had been killed on a city street. The last time the city had seen something similar, the era was different, the players louder, the cameras more numerous. This felt off-pattern, unsettling in a new way, because it didn't suggest a storm to come so much as a world colliding with randomness from outside. The funeral was private, restrained in the way he had lived. Family and friends gathered without spectacle. There were no public statements from people who mattered in his orbit. The people tasked with tracking fallout noted the lack of it. No wave of reprisals. No surge of arrests tied to a hastily launched vendetta. If anything, the event reinforced the evolution he had shepherded. A preference for calm, for avoiding attention, for absorbing a loss without multiplying it. The city, which had braced for a storyline from old movies, instead watched the neighborhood return to its usual pace, while a courtroom pushed through the slow business of evaluating a defendant whose mind might not meet the threshold for trial. The absence of a familiar narrative didn't erase the life that came before that night. His record in the United States featured one conviction: the 2008 extortion conspiracy he admitted to, for which he served roughly 16 months and then supervised release. Beyond that, the outline of his work came from officials and journalists who attributed to him a portfolio of activities long associated with his organization. Settling money disputes, maintaining gambling and loan operations at a level designed to avoid attention, leveraging influence in contracting circles, and above all, managing relationships that linked Staten Island and Brooklyn to Palermo. He was never convicted in U.S. courts of additional crimes after 2008, and Italian investigators who mentioned him as a trusted point of contact did not charge him in their own operations. Those distinctions matter. They define the difference between evidence weighed by judges and juries and the assessments that circulate among detectives and reporters. What made him consequential, according to those assessments, was his insistence on structure. He preferred to standardize the unsaid rules. Payments should arrive when expected. Disagreements should meet at a table, not on a sidewalk. Respect should flow in both directions. Family life should remain separate. He didn't present himself as a visionary. He presented himself as a custodian. You could see it in the way he organized legitimate work, moving goods with predictable accuracy, keeping crews on schedule, treating paperwork like a safeguard rather than a chore. That attention to systems carried over to the parts of his life that rarely show up in official ledgers. He was also a connector. Marriage into a Palermo clan gave him standing with elders whose approval mattered on both sides of the Atlantic. In the 2014-2015 Sicilian investigation that made waves in the press, recordings captured men speaking of Americans as relatives first and business partners second. His name surfaced in that context, as someone who could affirm or delay a plan, who could translate expectations without causing offense. The new bridge phrase that journalists loved was simply a label for what families had always done: share burdens and benefits across an ocean. He understood that kind of continuity intimately and protected it with patience. The patience made some people restless. Younger men in any enterprise want momentum they can measure. He offered them something different: durable footing. He taught by example that staying out of the news was a victory, that a quiet month was a sign of success, that leaving a meeting with everyone a little dissatisfied but no one humiliated was better than forcing a winner and creating a future enemy. In an era when many people confuse speed with strength, he believed the strongest thing in the room was control over one's own tempo. That's what he modeled day after day, even to those who only watched him from a distance. His reach didn't come from speeches. It came from reliability. If he said he would call, he called. If he set a time, he kept it. If he promised to hear both sides, he did. That consistency made him a magnet in a world where trust is scarce. It also made his final chapter particularly jarring. The threat that found him didn't care about schedules, norms, or the quiet agreements that keep rivalries contained. It wasn't about profit or territory. It was about a stranger's confusion crossing a property line and colliding with a national obsession over names that travel faster than facts. He had guarded against every risk he knew. The one he met was the kind that stands outside knowledge itself. For the city, the event became a mirror. It reflected how much had changed since the 1,980 seconds, when entire news cycles revolved around street feuds and courthouse drama. It showed a quieter underworld that had learned, sometimes the hard way, to survive by avoiding attention. It also showed a new landscape in which personal grievances, fueled by conspiracies that move at the speed of a scroll, can erupt in ways old playbooks never anticipated. His death wasn't just an ending. It was a signal that a carefully managed world can be disrupted by forces that don't recognize the boundaries it draws. In the months after, investigators revisited every line that connected him to others. They updated charts, re-interviewed informants, and listened for ripples that might signal a succession struggle. The ripples remained faint. People who followed the organization's internal life said the leadership model he favored committee-minded, Sicilian in its values, wary of any step that would tempt the spotlight held. No one wanted to invite new scrutiny by turning grief into noise. That restraint perhaps was his final influence. Even in his absence, the habits he taught kept tempers from doing what they might have done in a different era. The neighborhood adjusted. The porch light still came on at dusk. Mail still thumped into the box. The lawn was cut. Over time, the street reclaimed its daily rhythms. That's how cities protect themselves. They keep moving. Behind that motion, a family kept a private grief, and an institution reassessed without showing its work. The court system did what it does at its own pace. Evaluated a defendant's state of mind, scheduled hearings, postponed them, and scheduled them again. Reporters filed updates. Readers scanned headlines and moved on. But the people who understood what he had been to that quiet world, and the investigators who had tried for years to map his influence, didn't forget how unusual his life looked when measured against its end. To remember him fully, you have to hold the contrasts together. He was a husband and father who kept a low profile. He was a convicted extortion conspirator who served his time and came home. He was, according to federal and Italian authorities, a transatlantic broker and a consensus builder at the center of a modernized, discreet leadership, though never convicted for that role. He favored order over spectacle, patience over pressure, outcomes over applause. He believed in keeping the old banner out of the tabloids and the families that honored it out of unnecessary trouble. He didn't inhabit the mythology built around his world. He trimmed it back. The facts of that March evening will always overshadow the quiet that preceded it. Yet the quiet is the truer measure. In it, you can trace the steady hands that held together two coasts of the same sea, the caution that kept prosecutors short on tape-recorded victories, the manners that let rivals leave rooms without resentment. Those are the things that defined him more than a headline can. Those are the reasons people in both New York and Palermo spoke of him with a kind of subdued respect, even if they disagreed with what he represented. In a life where so much depends on unsaid rules, he made the rules feel solid again. The porch bulb still throws its small circle at night. A car glides past, muffled, then disappears. If you listen closely, you can still hear the rhythm he preferred. Conversations that end before they become arguments, decisions that avoid drawing a crowd, days that add up without drama. That rhythm, more than any title others tried to hang on him, was his legacy. He tended it carefully. He built it across decades. He believed it could outlast any one person. And for a time, even after the night that changed the block, it did. Morning routines return even after a shock. Garbage trucks still rumble through at the same hour. Kids still lean into their backpacks on the walk to school, and a neighbor's sprinkler still arcs across a strip of lawn. The city insists on moving. In the weeks after that night, his block did what every block does. It folded the noise back into daily life. Quiet came back, but it wasn't the same quiet. It held the knowledge that nothing is ever entirely under control, even for someone who built his world on keeping things steady. The case against the young man arrested moved through the courts at a careful pace. New Jersey papers ran photographs of a transfer from one custody to another. Then New York headlines followed with the arraignment. He entered a plea of not guilty. The scribbles on his palm drew attention, not because of artistry, but because of what they seemed to suggest references to fringe ideas that prosecutors said had nothing to do with organized disputes. His attorney raised mental health questions, and evaluations began. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled. There were motions about competency, about treatment, about where he should be held. News organizations filed updates every few months, always with the same conclusion. The process would take time. Nothing in those courtrooms resembled the old narratives of feud and retaliation. It was a different kind of story, sad, baffling, and personal, in a way that left investigators with fewer familiar signposts. While the legal machinery turned, the city's reporters and historians widened their lens. They revisited the path that had put him on that porch in the first place. He had been born in 1965 on Staten Island, a child of immigrants whose ties to Palermo were deep and persistent. His parents' generation measured character by how you carried yourself, not by what you said in public. He absorbed that code early. Work hard, waste few words, keep things in order, honor your elders, protect the house. As a teenager, he moved through neighborhoods where cousins and friends were never far. You learned who to greet, who to avoid, and how to listen without giving away more than you intended. He met a woman whose family name traced back to a storied Palermo clan. Marriage did more than blend two households. It knitted together two cities that already shared a language. Through her, he became kin to the Inzerillos, a family whose history marched through some of Sicily's hardest years. That background mattered in New York, where Sicilian-born and Sicilian-rooted figures had helped shape a quieter current beneath the louder surface of the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds. In that period, transatlantic lines of trust mattered as much as local muscle. He had both the temperament and the ties to thrive in that context. Sunday dinners in his home featured a mix of English and Sicilian, jokes that needed no translation, and the kind of long dessert conversations where decisions were as likely to be about school and repairs as about anything grand. The personal and the practical sat comfortably together. His public footprint included businesses that fit a New York life: food imports and distribution, warehousing, properties held through small companies. There were forklifts, clipboards, leases, vendor calls, and evenings spent looking over bills. People who dealt with him on that side knew him as steady, fair with deadlines, and exacting without being rude. He liked order. He liked routine. He didn't drag people into long meetings. He believed that work done well the first time prevented headaches later. Beyond those offices and loading docks, law enforcement accounts placed him at the center of an organization's slow transformation. After prosecutions diminished old guard lineups, a new model took hold: less ceremony, fewer gatherings that could be photographed, more emphasis on relationships that could withstand scrutiny. Officials and journalists described him as a bridge to Palermo, a diplomat who could translate New York concerns to Sicilian elders and carry back guidance that held. He wasn't indicted for that role, and courts did not declare him leader by title. Yet memoranda, surveillance notes, and interviews with veteran detectives returned to his name often. They spoke of arbitration sessions that ended with handshakes instead of accidents, of loan and gambling circuits run in ways designed to avoid creating victims who might go to police, of pressure applied to business disputes in tones that suggested resolution rather than explosive confrontation. These were attributions by authorities rather than convictions against him personally. The notable exception remains the extortion conspiracy case from 2008 that he admitted, served, and moved past. That 2008 case grew out of a sweeping operation that took aim at dozens of figures. Prosecutors said he joined others in a scheme to collect money through intimidation in a commercial dispute. The paperwork traced calls, meetings, and the expectation that a debt would be satisfied because of who was asking. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy, drew a sentence of about 16 months, and returned to Staten Island with a plan most men in his world would recognize. Keep a low profile, keep both sides of life organized, keep emotions out of decisions. No violent count attached to his case. He did not contest the government's summary in open court. He accepted the outcome and served the time. He re-entered a world that suited him even better after the loudest seasons had passed. In 2011, a Sicilian-born veteran moved into the top seat according to the FBI and longtime beat reporters. The organization's day-to-day shifted toward smaller rooms and more disciplined habits. Observers put our subject in that inner circle. They said he sometimes acted as a captain or as an interim manager when needed, and that he often served as the person who could tell rival factions enough and make it stick. In 2015, an Italian probe in Palermo released transcripts that mentioned him as a trusted contact, someone who could verify whether New York agreed with a plan. He was not charged in that operation. The portrait in Italy and the one in New York matched. Respectful, persistent, detail-oriented, careful about pride, unconcerned with applause. He didn't mount campaigns. He built process. Younger men who preferred speed learned patience by watching him. He could sit through two heated stories, subtract the exaggerations, and arrive at a split that both sides could accept without losing face. He valued schedules over stunts and imposed boundaries between home and everything else. That boundary was so firm that neighbors would later insist they never saw crowds, never noticed luxury cars, never felt watched. To them, he was a polite man with a family who prioritized school and repairs and a tidy yard. The question often asked after his death was what would become of the structure he helped maintain. Law enforcement sources floated familiar names: veterans from the Sicilian-rooted wing, men who had kept their own profiles low, operators with ties to the same Palermo neighborhoods that had produced him as a leader. Analysts suggested that a figure like Lorenzo Menino, long connected to the same cohort and respected in both cities, might take on a larger role. Others mentioned Domenico Cefalù as a constant presence with enduring influence. None of that appeared in indictments. It appeared in articles and background briefings that leaned on analysts' reading of patterns. What did appear, unmistakably, was the absence of visible turmoil. No wave of arrests connected to a rush of reprisals. No public grab for stature. The quiet held. The lack of drama after such a headline confused people expecting an older script, but his influence had always run counter to that script. He taught a style, and the style outlived him. Meet early and privately, keep phones out of reach, explain decisions kindly but firmly, and leave people away back from mistakes. Even before March 2019, Agents said the organization had become less interested in splashy rackets and more invested in steady income streams that caused fewer headaches. They mapped loan operations calibrated to avoid pushing borrowers to police, gambling that ran on trust with little advertising, and quiet leverage in contracting where a word in the right ear could smooth a small problem without creating a big one. Again, these were assessments, not convictions against him personally, and must be understood that way. But they described a philosophy: no noise, no heroics, no mess. That philosophy owed something to Palermo. The Inzerillo family's past included exile and return, a cycle that taught patience. When Italian police launched operations in the 2000s and 2010 seconds, some nicknamed in the press as rebuilding efforts in the city's underworld, they captured a tone on wiretaps that felt almost domestic. Men spoke of cousins across the ocean, of respect for elders, of shared burdens. New York wasn't a distant partner, it was family. He moved in that space easily. He knew the elders by name, the customs by heart, and the balance to strike between honoring tradition and avoiding trouble. If Palermo wanted to test a plan, he would ask about timing and optics. If New York needed Palermo to wait, he would make the case in a way that didn't cause offense. The choices that filled his workdays rarely generated paper, by design. He avoided long calls. He avoided restaurants where people recognized faces. He liked the front seat of a car parked in a busy lot, or a walk that looked like a walk. He treated the internet like a hazard, not a tool. Investigators recognized those habits and spoke of negative space, what they couldn't capture, where he wasn't, what he didn't say. They looked for the people around him, hoping someone else's mistake would supply proof. Often, it didn't. The gap between suspicion and admissible evidence remained wide. That wasn't luck, it was method. He paid equal attention to the simple things that nest inside family life. Good schools, a sense of safety, being on time for the moments that matter. He took pride in being present, in keeping promises that had nothing to do with the larger world audiences imagined around his name. That duality confuses outsiders, but it's the defining feature of people who survive long in that universe. You blend. You become part of the neighborhood. You don't give anyone a story to tell. After he was gone, the stories others told stayed surprisingly consistent across camps that usually disagree. Police and prosecutors called him measured and disciplined. Reporters who spent careers on the beat described him as practical and remarkably hard to catch doing or saying anything that would become a clean case. People in his orbit remembered a calm man who listened, asked short questions, and expected adults to act like adults. You can hold all those pictures at once. They don't contradict each other. They explain how someone could become central without becoming famous. The only charge that ended up as a conviction was the 2008 extortion conspiracy. It is the one crime you can discuss with legal certainty. It tells you he operated inside the pressure economy that supports old institutions. Debts must be settled, expectations must be met, and people who benefit from a structure are expected to honor it in return. Outside that, you step into a well-documented fog dense with surveillance summaries, interviews with confidential sources, and published analyses where patterns are strong but courtroom proof is scarce. He lived in that fog comfortably. He followed rules designed to keep it foggy. That comfort was not complacency. He knew the risks. He had watched a prior generation get caught on tapes, filmed leaving meetings that prosecutors later played for juries, undone by their own love of ceremony. He helped push the culture away from that. No social clubs, with names that drew cameras. No grand events that forced people to park in the same place at the same time. No rituals that gave an investigator an anchor point. In their place, routine. Small rooms, short talks, scattered locations, and, when possible, business that could be explained in ordinary terms. For those trying to understand what remains after a life like his ends, the answer is the routine he left behind. The habits. The restraint. The preference for systems over stunts. Observers say that is what his colleagues kept. When a problem arose in the months following, people expected a quiet sit-down rather than a show of force. When a payment lagged, someone made a call instead of a scene. When a younger person tried to impress, an older one suggested patience. This was the culture he had reinforced, the result of years spent sanding drama off decisions. The court case involving the accused shooter continued to grind through questions of sanity and responsibility. There were reports about treatment in custody and expert assessments. Some hearings happened in person, others were delayed. Still others focused on whether the defendant could understand the charges and assist his attorneys. Through those updates, his name stayed in headlines less as a character in a familiar feud, and more as a victim in a confusing episode that law and mental health systems were struggling to classify. That framing changed how the public remembered him less as a symbol of an institution, and more as a neighbor whose private routines were interrupted by something senseless. Memory works that way. Over time, the small things expand. A porch light, a short wave to a neighbor, a driveway that always looked neat. People who didn't know him at all learned those details from articles and from locals who volunteered them. They took comfort in the thought that someone can be complicated and still be consistent. They also took a lesson that the quietest style is not invincibility. Control has limits. Patterns shield you from risks you recognize, not from every risk. When conversations turned, as they always do in New York, to the broader arc of his era, a few dates and names recurred. The 2008 plea and prison term, the 2011 ascent of a reserved Sicilian, born leader, the 2015 Italian operation that called him a transatlantic contact, the 2017 death of a revered Cherry Hill elder whose absence reshaped influence, the March 2019 killing that shook a block and revived old headlines. Between those points lies the longer story of daily choices that avoided spectacle. That is the stretch worth studying if you want to understand what he did and how he did it. He practiced a trade that resists dramatic telling, the work of preventing trouble. You will not find it in transcripts because it often consists of what didn't happen, meetings that ended early, words that weren't said, deals that didn't break. Yet those non-events kept a structure stable for years. That was his craft. It is not an argument for or against the world he moved in. It is a description of how he operated within it. He believed constancy could be built. He spent his adult life proving it most days. As the seasons rolled on, the city absorbed his absence the way it absorbs most things, by continuing. The organization adapted by doing what it had been doing. Reducing exposure, sharing authority among men who didn't crave attention, nurturing ties to Palermo quietly, and protecting the separation between home and business. Whether you see that as prudence or as a way to extend an old enterprise depends on your vantage point. Either way, it reinforced the truth at the center of his story. He was not the loudest man in the room. He did not seek power through performance. He shaped outcomes by respecting limits, by listening, and by insisting that peace, when possible, was a smarter investment than heat. On evenings when the Bay Air drifts inland and porch bulbs click on one by one, his street looks as it did before any of this made the news. Behind one door, a family keeps a private set of memories that includes school mornings, holiday phone calls to Sicily, fixes around the house, and 1,000 small kindnesses few saw. Beyond that door, a broader community remembers a headline and a cautionary tale about how modern confusion can crash into old structures. Both are true. Both belong to him. Legacies in New York are often assembled from small, unremarkable pieces. A name on a lease, a delivery schedule penciled in a notebook, a list of phone numbers you keep in your head instead of on paper. His was built out of those pieces. The record people can point to is compact: a birth year, a marriage that tied him to Palermo, a guilty plea to extortion conspiracy in 2008, a sentence he served, a quiet return, and a violent end that drew headlines for reasons few expected. Around that compact record sits the larger outline produced by investigators and reporters over decades, a portrait of a reserved operator who helped steer an old organization toward a lower profile. When you place those layers together, you get a life that carried influence without ceremony. Understanding that influence means stepping back to the years that shaped the families he connected. In the 1,980 seconds, Sicilian clans from Palermo endured a season of blood and upheaval that sent a stream of relatives to the United States. In and around New York and New Jersey, the Cherry Hill circle anchored by Gambino relatives from Sicily became a haven. Those households spoke the same dialect, honored the same elders, and kept alive obligations that outlasted news cycles. He grew into adulthood in that environment. Marriage deepened it. By wedding into the Inzerillo line, he became kin to a Palermo name, with roots that reached into New York's Gambino structure. That union mattered not because it made him famous, but because it placed him at the intersection of trust networks on both sides of the ocean. Authorities began to speak about him with more specificity in the late 1992s and early 2000s. Without issuing formal titles through courts, they nevertheless described him as part of a Sicilian wing, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in articles and background briefings. Those briefings said he embodied a managerial style that looked more like logistics than theater. Keep books in order, settle disputes face-to-face, favor predictable revenue over high-risk ventures, and avoid situations that hand prosecutors clean evidence. Reporters echoed that description. They wrote about a man who rarely appeared in photographs, who stayed away from social clubs that drew cameras, and who preferred unremarkable places for short conversations. The first time the public record pinned him down came with the 2008 case that rolled up dozens of people connected by prosecutors to the same organization. That operation, built on surveillance, wiretaps, and the cooperation of a Staten Island businessman in the trucking and construction sphere, produced indictments that filled pages. In that stack was a count that would define the legal part of his story: conspiracy to commit extortion. The government's filings described a business dispute, money expected, and pressure applied to ensure payment. He did not face a violent charge in that case. He pleaded guilty to the conspiracy count. A federal judge sentenced him to a term of roughly 16 months and supervised release. He served the time, followed the court's conditions, and returned home in 2009. That conviction is the one crime that can be stated plainly. It stands in the record without qualifiers. Afterward, he resumed the same reserved routine his neighbors recognized: school runs, business visits, a preference for being home at dinner. Inside law enforcement offices, however, analysts moved his name closer to the center of organizational charts. In 2011, a Sicilian-born veteran took the top position according to the FBI and longtime beat reporters. Those same sources listed our subject among the handful of trusted lieutenants who made the system work day to day. Sometimes he was described as a captain, sometimes as an acting figure when needed, sometimes simply as the person whose quiet verdict ended arguments. None of those titles were adjudicated in court. They were the judgments of investigators and journalists who watch patterns for a living. His legitimate work continued to provide shape to his days. Food distribution and related logistics gave him places to be, invoices to sign, and a reason to call vendors and landlords. People who dealt with him on that side of life described a courteous manager who valued punctuality, disliked drama, and enforced standards without raising his voice. That demeanor carried into the other parts of his life that investigators attributed to him: oversight of loan and gambling circuits calibrated to stay below thresholds that trigger complaints, influence in contracting disputes where the point was to smooth problems rather than create new ones, and a mediator's approach to turf questions. Those descriptions live in affidavits, memos, and articles. They did not become convictions in his name. The exception remained the 2008 plea. Meanwhile, Italian prosecutors were testing whether exiled Palermo families had rebuilt. In 2014, 2015, an operation in Sicily generated wiretaps and arrests that journalists summarized under a banner suggesting a new bridge between Palermo and New York. In those records, his name surfaced as a reliable contact, someone who could relay approvals, request patience, or confirm that an agreement held. He was not charged in that case. The characterization mirrored the American one: a diplomatic operator who spoke both languages, New York's blunt efficiency and Palermo's ceremonious caution. He did not invent that posture. He learned it from elders who survived by avoiding noise. The Cherry Hill Circle had taught the value of steadiness. Men like John Gambino modeled a way of moving that shunned spectacle and prized long relationships. When John died in 2017, observers said influence shifted subtly. The void made the next generation of Sicilian-rooted leaders more important. Reporters placed our subject in that set. His authority, they wrote, came not from domination, but from the ability to get diverse personalities to accept a middle ground. He left egos intact, which meant people came back to the table rather than plotting a way around it. A large part of his effectiveness came from habits that sound ordinary but become rare in crisis. Conversations were short. Pride was acknowledged but not indulged. People were given a path to save face. If someone owed money, he wanted a plan, not a scene. If two earners clashed, he insisted on numbers, not stories. If a contractor complained, he asked whether the fix could be made without delaying everything else. He treated pressure like a tool you use carefully, not a weapon you swing. That approach reduced exposure. It also fit a broader shift officials noticed. A move away from high-profile rackets that had toppled earlier bosses towards steadier income that could pass for normal commerce to anyone not looking closely. That distinction matters when you consider how little hard evidence surfaced with his name on it after 2008. Agents complained about negative space in their files. The calls he didn't make, the meetings he refused, the way he stepped out of rooms where people might say too much. They mapped associates, tracked vehicles, and waited. They found less than they expected because he engineered his life to produce less. Even technology was treated like a liability. He avoided texts that could be misread, left phones behind for certain conversations, and picked meeting spots that looked like errands. The New York-Palermo axis he helped maintain rested on gestures as much as directives. Elders in Sicily cared about tone. New York cared about timing. He threaded those needs. Italian transcripts captured men speaking of the Americans as cousins and partners, not as distant shareholders. That language signals something beyond business, a shared memory that creates obligations, even when money isn't on the table. He understood that memory and kept it intact. If Palermo signaled caution, he respected it. If New York needed clarity, he supplied it without offense. That's the kind of quiet work that keeps alliances from fraying. By the time headlines began to call him the boss or acting boss, he had already hardened into a figure defined by denial. Denial of vanity. Denial of habits that tempt investigators. Denial of the urge to answer every challenge with force. The labels came from law enforcement sources and veteran reporters. Courts did not certify them. He did not comment. He carried himself the same way he had before. Few words, predictable hours, attention to family, attention to business, attention to what could go wrong and how to make sure it didn't. What did go wrong in March 2019 defied the logic that had guided everything else. The arrest in New Jersey days later stunned observers because it didn't fit any of the templates they kept on hand. Prosecutors pointed to a suspect far outside the circles that had filled their notebooks for years. The defense pointed to delusions and internet-driven conspiracies. Hearings centered on competency rather than on underworld motives. The accused remained in custody while doctors and judges evaluated whether he understood the charges and could assist in his own defense. Updates followed over the next years, reporting that he had been found unfit to stand trial at various points and was being treated under court supervision. The case turned into a slow study in mental health and responsibility rather than an index of organized crime tensions. Inside the organization he left behind, the sky did not fall. Analysts suggested that stewardship shifted to other men from the same Sicilian-to-leaning set names that had appeared for years in investigative chatter, men who valued the same caution he had preached. They spoke of Lorenzo Menino and Domenico Cefalù as steady hands, not because of public declarations, but because the quiet persisted. Businesses associated with legitimate income kept operating. The kinds of disputes that never reached newspapers were still settled without incident. If there was a succession, it looked like what he had built. Gradual, consensual, unremarkable from the curb. Knowing all this changes how you read the most public moments of his life. The 2008 plea wasn't a confession to a career. It was a precise admission to a specific conspiracy, followed by time served and compliance. The years after were not a retreat. They were a deliberate normalization. The March 2019 killing wasn't the opening of a feud. It was, according to officials and the court record that followed, a tragedy that fell outside the rules his world had long enforced. And the quiet that came after wasn't indifference. It was the culture he had spent years strengthening, refusing to answer unpredictability with more of the same. People often want clean stories. Rise, reign, fall. His story resists that shape. He rose, if you trust the investigator's charts. He reigned, if you define reign as the ability to keep tempers low and revenue steady. He fell not to an old rival, but to a new kind of unpredictability. Between those points are the daily choices that describe him better than any title. Say less. Arrive on time. Count twice. Leave room for pride without letting it run the meeting. Separate home from everything else. And keep the old ties to Palermo warm without letting them ignite. It is important to be clear about crimes because clarity anchors memory. He pleaded guilty to extortion conspiracy in 2008 and served a federal sentence. That is in the record. The rest of the acts attributed to him survising loan and gambling circuits, exerting pressure and contracting, mediating turf questions, and functioning as a transatlantic contact live in affidavits, surveillance summaries, and news reporting. They sketch a plausible map of his responsibilities without becoming convictions attached to his name. He operated in that gap skillfully. He kept it a gap on purpose. Time has a way of simplifying reputations. Years from now, people will remember a quiet Staten Island figure with Sicilian ties who, according to authorities, guided a storied organization into a lower-key era and who died in a way that felt detached from, that would define the legal part of his story, conspiracy to commit extortion. The government's filings described a business dispute, money expected, and pressure applied to ensure payment. He did not face a violent charge in that case. He pleaded guilty to the conspiracy count. A federal judge sentenced him to a term of roughly 16 months and supervised release. He served the time, followed the court's conditions, and returned home in 2009. That conviction is the one crime that can be stated plainly. It stands in the record without qualifiers. Afterward, he resumed the same reserved routine his neighbors recognized. School runs, business visits, a preference for being home at dinner. Inside law enforcement offices, however, analysts moved his name closer to the center of organizational charts. In 2011, a Sicilian-born veteran took the top position according to the FBI and longtime beat reporters. Those same sources listed our subject among the handful of trusted lieutenants who made the system work day to day. Sometimes he was described as a captain, sometimes as an acting figure when needed, sometimes simply as the person whose quiet verdict ended arguments. None of those titles were adjudicated in court. They were the judgments of investigators and journalists who watch patterns for a living. His legitimate work continued to provide shape to his days. Food distribution and related logistics gave him places to be, invoices to sign, and a reason to call vendors and landlords. People who dealt with him on that side of life described a courteous manager who valued punctuality, disliked drama, and enforced standards without raising his voice. That demeanor carried into the other parts of his life that investigators attributed to him. Oversight of loan and gambling circuits calibrated to stay below thresholds that trigger complaints, influence in contracting disputes where the point was to smooth problems rather than create new ones, and a mediator's approach to turf questions. Those descriptions live in affidavits, memos, and articles. They did not become convictions in his name. The exception remained the 2008 plea. Meanwhile, Italian prosecutors were testing whether exiled Palermo families had rebuilt. In 2014, 2015, an operation in Sicily generated wiretaps and arrests that journalists summarized under a banner, suggesting a new bridge between Palermo and New York. In those records, his name surfaced as a reliable contact, someone who could relay approvals, request patience, or confirm that an agreement held. He was not charged in that case. The characterization mirrored the American one, a diplomatic operator who spoke both languages, New York's blunt efficiency and Palermo's ceremonious caution. He did not invent that posture. He learned it from elders who survived by avoiding noise. The Cherry Hill Circle had taught the value of steadiness. Men like John Gambino modeled a way of moving that shunned spectacle and prized long relationships. When John died in 2017, observers said influence shifted subtly. The void made the next generation of Sicilian-rooted leaders more important. Reporters placed our subject in that set. His authority, they wrote, came not from domination, but from the ability to get diverse personalities to accept a middle ground. He left egos intact, which meant people came back to the table rather than plotting a way around it. A large part of his effectiveness came from habits that sound ordinary but become rare in crisis. Conversations were short. Pride was acknowledged but not indulged. People were given a path to save face. If someone owed money, he wanted a plan, not a scene. If two earners clashed, he insisted on numbers, not stories. If a contractor complained, He asked whether the fix could be made without delaying everything else. He treated pressure like a tool you use carefully, not a weapon you swing. That approach reduced exposure. It also fit a broader shift officials noticed. A move away from high-profile rackets that had toppled earlier bosses towards steadier income that could pass for normal commerce to anyone not looking closely. That distinction matters when you consider how little hard evidence surfaced with his name on it after 2008. Agents complained about negative space in their files. The calls he didn't make, the meetings he refused, the way he stepped out of rooms where people might say too much. They mapped associates, tracked vehicles, and waited. They found less than they expected because he engineered his life to produce less. Even technology was treated like a liability. He avoided texts that could be misread, left phones behind for certain conversations, and picked meeting spots that looked like errands. The New York-Palermo axis he helped maintain rested on gestures as much as directives. Elders in Sicily cared about tone. New York cared about timing. He threaded those needs. Italian transcripts captured men speaking of the Americans as cousins and partners, not as distant shareholders. That language signals something beyond business, a shared memory that creates obligations, even when money isn't on the table. He understood that memory and kept it intact. If Palermo signaled caution, he respected it. If New York needed clarity, he supplied it without offense. That's the kind of quiet work that keeps alliances from fraying. By the time headlines began to call him the boss or acting boss, he had already hardened into a figure defined by denial. Denial of vanity. Denial of habits that tempt investigators. Denial of the urge to answer every challenge with force. The labels came from law enforcement sources and veteran reporters. Courts did not certify them. He did not comment. He carried himself the same way he had before. Few words, predictable hours, attention to family, attention to business, attention to what could go wrong and how to make sure it didn't. What did go wrong in March 2019 defied the logic that had guided everything else. The arrest in New Jersey days later stunned observers because it didn't fit any of the templates they kept on hand. Prosecutors pointed to a suspect far outside the circles that had filled their notebooks for years. The defense pointed to delusions and internet-driven conspiracies. Hearings centered on competency rather than on underworld motives. The accused remained in custody while doctors and judges evaluated whether he understood the charges and could assist in his own defense. Updates followed over the next years, reporting that he had been found unfit to stand trial at various points and was being treated under court supervision. The case turned into a slow study in mental health and responsibility rather than an index of organized crime tensions. Inside the organization he left behind, the sky did not fall. Analysts suggested that stewardship shifted to other men from the same Sicilian-to-leaning set names that had appeared for years in investigative chatter, men who valued the same caution he had preached. They spoke of Lorenzo Menino and Domenico Cefalù as steady hands, not because of public declarations, but because the quiet persisted. Businesses associated with legitimate income kept operating. The kinds of disputes that never reached newspapers were still settled without incident. If there was a succession, it looked like what he had built. Gradual, consensual, unremarkable from the curb. Knowing all this changes how you read the most public moments of his life. The 2008 plea wasn't a confession to a career. It was a precise admission to a specific conspiracy, followed by time served and compliance. The years after were not a retreat. They were a deliberate normalization. The March 2019 killing wasn't the opening of a feud. It was, according to officials and the court record that followed, a tragedy that fell outside the rules his world had long enforced. And the quiet that came after wasn't indifference. It was the culture he had spent years strengthening, refusing to answer unpredictability with more of the same. People often want clean stories. Rise, reign, fall. His story resists that shape. He rose, if you trust the investigator's charts. He reigned, if you define reign as the ability to keep tempers low and revenue steady. He fell not to an old rival, but to a new kind of unpredictability. Between those points are the daily choices that describe him better than any title. Say less. Arrive on time. Count twice. Leave room for pride without letting it run the meeting. Separate home from everything else. And keep the old ties to Palermo warm without letting them ignite. It is important to be clear about crimes because clarity anchors memory. He pleaded guilty to extortion conspiracy in 2008 and served a federal sentence. That is in the record. The rest of the acts attributed to him supervising loan and gambling circuits, exerting pressure and contracting, mediating turf questions, and functioning as a transatlantic contact live in affidavits, surveillance summaries, and news reporting. They sketch a plausible map of his responsibilities without becoming convictions attached to his name. He operated in that gap skillfully. He kept it a gap on purpose. Time has a way of simplifying reputations. Years from now, people will remember a quiet Staten Island figure with Sicilian ties who, according to authorities, guided a storied organization into a lower-key era, and who died in a way that felt detached from. Succession occurred, it matched the culture he had reinforced. Incremental, low-wowkey, and invisible to anyone not paid to watch. Looking back across his life through the lens of what is verifiable and what is attributable, a few themes hold. He accepted responsibility for a specific federal crime in 2008 and completed his sentence. He kept his household out of the spotlight and treated domestic routines as non-negotiable. He cultivated a working relationship with Palermo that rested on respect for elders and patience with process. He built a leadership profile that emphasized systems over theater, predictability over improvisation, and de-escalation over dominance. Authorities credited him with steering loan, gambling, and contracting influence into safer channels, and with serving as a transatlantic mediator. Courts did not convict him for those broader roles. That gap between allegation and adjudication defines much of his public record. Accuracy matters in a story like this because myth resists nuance. He did not run the city. He did not spend his days in smoky rooms giving speeches. He spent them balancing calendars, fielding calls he kept short, visiting warehouses, and meeting people eye to eye in unremarkable places where problems could be solved without creating new ones. His strength came from consistency. He showed up. He listened. He offered solutions that saved face. He believed that dignity can prevent disasters. Friends and neighbors still describe a gentle presence who valued family. Investigators still describe a disciplined operator who minimized exposure. Reporters still describe a figure who fit into a Sicilian-rooted leadership group that brought a historic organization into a cautious present. These portraits can sit side by side without contradiction. They explain why he stayed out of court after 2008, and why, when the worst finally happened, there was no appetite among his peers to multiply the damage by adding fire to shock. Even the language people use about him reflects the balance he chased. In Italy, men on tapes called their American cousins family, not partners. In New York, people who dealt with him on paperwork called him reliable, not connected. Detectives used words like ambassador, mediator, and stabilizer. None of those terms fit the cinematic template. All of them fit a city that survives on pragmatism. Every life like his leaves behind a toolkit. The pieces are unglamorous. Keep appointments, treat pride carefully, make decisions early in the day, avoid places where others perform, maintain ties that are old enough to be trusted, refuse to be hurried into mistakes, let others talk, speak briefly, confirm quietly. You can apply that toolkit to a warehouse floor as easily as to a delicate sit-down. That portability made him effective. It also made him hard to corner, because nothing about the toolkit announces itself as evidence. What remains, years on, is a cautionary tale in two directions. For law enforcement, it's a reminder that the modern version of an old institution can survive by shrinking its footprint and letting managers like him set a calm pace. For anyone inclined to romanticize that world, it's a reminder that the only documented crime on his record after decades of suspicion was the 2008 conspiracy he admitted, and that the event that ended his life had no place in the old codes. Reality refuses to match fiction on either side. The softest measure of his legacy lives in the routines that resumed after he was gone. Staten Island blocks went back to school mornings, light traffic, and sidewalk conversations that last just long enough. Phones still ring in Palermo homes on holidays. Men who learned from him still pull out chairs before tempers rise. The choices that kept him out of headlines for years kept others out after him. That continuity says more about what he built than any label ever could. Count the fixed points one more time for clarity. Born in 1965 to a family with roots in Palermo, married into the Inzerillos, deepening cross-ocean ties, built legitimate businesses around food distribution and property. Identified by investigators as a key figure in a Siciliano-leaning leadership group, pleaded guilty in 2008 to federal extortion conspiracy, served roughly 16 months, returned home. Frequently described by authorities and journalists as a mediator and Transatlantic bridge, not convicted in U.S. courts of additional crimes after 2008. Killed in 2019 outside his Staten Island home, a young, unrelated defendant arrested days later, with court proceedings focused on competency and mental health rather than organized rivalry. Quiet inside his circle before and after. Those are the bones of the story. The rest, the style, the restraint, the insistence on order fills in the shape. He did not own the skyline, but he understood how the city breathes. He did not speak often, but he picked words that landed. He did not claim a throne, but he kept things running. There is a dignity in that kind of work, even when it unfolds inside institutions many reject. You can acknowledge the harm such institutions have done while still describing, accurately and without embellishment, how one person tried to keep their edges from tearing into something loud and reckless. That is who he was in the years after his one conviction. That is why, when people in both New York and Palermo speak of him now, they do so in measured tones. Quiet built his influence. Quiet carried it forward. Quiet, more than any other force, explains how his story traveled so far without leaving a trail of noise. Some lives keep echoing after the front door closes for the last time. Not in loud ways, not in stories told for applause, but in the steady manners others keep using because they worked. That's what remained in the months and years that followed. People who had learned from him still arranged quiet meetings before tempers rose. They still checked their pride, counted twice, and avoided places where a careless moment becomes a headline. The city kept humming. Palermo kept its cadence. Between them was a well-traveled path he had helped smooth, a path others now walked with the same slow, careful steps. If you trace the line back to the beginning, the shape stays simple. He was born in 1965 on Staten Island to a family with roots sunk deeply into Palermo's soil. He grew up in neighborhoods where you learned as much by watching as by listening. He married into the Inzerillo clan, a Palermo family with a long memory and a wide circle of cousins in New York and New Jersey, including the Cherry Hill branch that gave structure and example to his generation. That marriage did more than connect two households. It placed him at a junction where expectations crossed the ocean quietly, under the radar of anyone who wasn't listening closely. He built a public life that could stand on its own. Food import and distribution work gave him forklifts and loading docks, drivers and invoices, leases and repairs. Everything a typical small or mid-size operation in New York lives on. People who dealt with him in that world describe a man who returned calls, honored schedules, and enforced standards without theatrics. He liked regular hours. He liked being home for dinner. He liked the predictability that comes from doing ordinary things well. Beside that visible routine ran a current described by detectives and reporters, the part of his life that never turned into a stack of convictions with his name at the top. Authorities said he belonged to a Sicilian-leaning leadership set inside a historic New York organization, a group that prized discretion and treated Palermo less as a foreign city than as an extension of family. They said he became a diplomat, someone who translated New York's bluntness into terms elders in Sicily respected, and who carried Palermo's caution back in words that men in Staten Island and Brooklyn could accept. They credited him with keeping familiar revenue streams steady and quiet. Loans that rarely pushed borrowers toward police, gambling small enough to avoid panic, subtle leverage in contracting meant to solve problems rather than stir them. Those attributions filled surveillance affidavits and background briefings. They did not become verdicts in a courtroom. The one federal crime he admitted is the one that can be cited precisely. That crime arrived in 2008, when a broad sweep gathered dozens tied by prosecutors to the same umbrella. A Staten Island businessman who had begun cooperating with authorities provided key recordings. In that pile of paperwork sat a charge against him: conspiracy to commit extortion. The government described a straightforward pressure play in a commercial dispute: money expected, money delayed, messages delivered to close the gap. He pleaded guilty to that conspiracy. No violent count accompanied it. A judge sentenced him to roughly 16 months in federal custody and supervised release. He served his time. News accounts later noted that he was out the following year and returned to Staten Island with the same preference for quiet that had carried him to that point. That is the documented crime. It stands without embellishment. The years after his release were the ones that shaped his reputation most. In 2011, a Siciliana-born veteran, Domenico Cefalù, was identified by law enforcement sources and seasoned reporters as the official head. The organization under that leadership kept shrinking its visible footprint. It favored fewer big meetings, fewer phone calls, and fewer stunts. Analysts placed him in the small circle that implemented that style day to day, sometimes calling him a captain, sometimes an acting hand, sometimes simply the steady presence whose nod meant an argument was over. Courts never issued a title for him. He never advertised one. Across the Atlantic, Italian prosecutors ran an operation in 2014, 2015, that generated headlines about a new bridge between Palermo and New York. Released transcripts suggested that elders in Sicily were rebuilding old networks and wanted to be sure their American counterparts agreed on pace and priorities. His name surfaced there as a trusted contact who could confirm, delay, or decline with respect. He wasn't charged. The portrait sounded familiar to anyone who followed the American side. Quiet, diplomatic, protective of relationships that had survived harsher seasons. That way of working depended on rituals that were intentionally boring. He kept messages short, met in everyday places, avoided cameras, and treated technology like a trap to be stepped around rather than a convenience to be embraced. Agents who wanted tape of him ended up documenting where he wasn't. They grumbled about negative space, the silences he curated, the rooms he left before someone said too much. The decisions finalized in moments that never created a clean record. It wasn't luck. It was method. His influence, if you accept the judgments of investigators and journalists who watched him for years, came from solving problems with a light touch. He let pride cool. He offered plans instead of ultimatums. He kept numbers precise and emotions out of the way. Younger men learned to slow down by watching him. Older ones, who remembered how the cameras of the 1,980 seconds ruined lives, appreciated his refusal to give anyone a show. The most consistent compliment you hear, even from those who couldn't say it on the record, is simple. He kept things from getting out of hand. What none of that foresaw was the event that ended his life in March 2019. Police and prosecutors built a case quickly, and it did not match the old scripts. Days after the attack, they arrested a 24-year-old from Staten Island named Anthony Camello in New Jersey. The case landed in court with questions that had nothing to do with Palermo or internal rivals. The defense raised claims of delusional beliefs drawn from internet conspiracies. Prosecutors focused on the act itself. Proceedings centered on competency to stand trial and treatment in custody. Over the years that followed, reports noted that judges found him unfit at points and ordered further evaluation and care, while the case remained unresolved. No wave of reprisals followed. No parallel arrests signaled a feud. The story was as much about mental health and modern confusion as it was about anything tied to the structures he had navigated for decades. The absence of a familiar aftermath is part of his legacy. The organization he helped shape did not answer shock with spectacle. Analysts suggested quiet continuity under figures long associated with the same cautious approach. Men like Lorenzo Menino, alongside Cefalù, names that appear often in investigative chatter, but rarely in courtrooms. Legitimate businesses kept their schedules. Disputes that could have escalated were kept small. If a succession unfolded, it looked like him. Incremental and unremarkable from the sidewalk. Step back, and a clear outline emerges from a life that tried very hard to leave none. He was a son of Staten Island, with Palermo roots. He married into the Inzerillo family, linking two cities that already felt like one extended household. He built legitimate enterprises that grounded his days and made his routines visible and ordinary. He pleaded guilty to a federal extortion conspiracy in 2008, served his sentence, and kept his head down afterward. He was widely described by authorities and beat reporters as a key figure in a Sicilian-leaning leadership model that favored diplomacy, low profiles, and transatlantic harmony. He was never convicted in U.S. courts of broader rackets after 2008, and he was not charged in the Italian operations that mentioned him as a contact. He died outside his home at the hands of a young man whom prosecutors and psychiatric experts described in ways that placed the crime outside the old rulebook. Inside that outline are smaller truths that reveal character. He liked to be on time. He preferred to hear a problem once, think for a breath, and answer in a sentence. He didn't mistake volume for authority. He kept promises at home with the same precision he kept them elsewhere. He drew a hard line between family life and whatever else a day demanded. He avoided gloating, gossip, and the small humiliations that turn into bigger problems later. He understood that people remembered tone more than content. He guarded tone. In telling a life like his, accuracy matters more than drama. It's accurate to say he committed a federal extortion conspiracy in 2008 and paid a price for it. It's accurate to say he was linked by authorities to a leadership role that helped a historic organization adjust to a quieter era. It's accurate to say he treated Palermo as family and managed that relationship with care. It's accurate to say he avoided the mistakes that generated crisp evidence and took down many before him. It's accurate to say his death did not fit the narrative that observers expected, and that the legal aftermath has largely concerned the defendant's mental fitness rather than rivalries or retribution. What you make of the rest depends on where you stand. Some see his restraint as a stabilizing force that prevented harm from spreading farther than it needed to. Others see restraint as a strategy that allowed old structures to persist when they should have collapsed. The two views don't cancel each other out. They define a tension that runs through any honest account of his world. He wasn't a caricature. He was a man who believed order could be imposed on an unruly business, and who tried to impose it without calling attention to himself. The final measure of a person often rests in what people choose to keep after they're gone. From him, they kept the habit of pausing before speaking. They kept the idea that real authority doesn't need a stage. They kept the rule that home is not a backdrop for work. They kept the cross-ocean courtesy that treats a call to Palermo like a call to a cousin, not a shareholder. They kept a preference for plans that fit into ordinary life, not plans that reorder it. Those are small things, and they add up. If you visit the block where he lived, nothing tells you any of this. The lawn is trimmed. The streetlights glow on schedule. People come and go with the same half-attention that keeps the city from wearing itself out. That's how it should be. In the quiet he preferred, lives advance without commentary. History passes on in gestures rather than speeches. Someone checks a lock without thinking. Someone calls an elder in Palermo before deciding. Someone ends a meeting 5 minutes early because there's nothing left to say. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't need a plaque. He knew from a young age that the loudest man in the room is often the least secure. He learned to treat every conversation like a negotiation with the future. Don't say what you don't need to. Don't take more than you can carry. Don't draw a circle so wide you can't protect it. He built a reputation on constancy. He accepted the consequences of the one crime he admitted. He didn't pretend the rest away. He simply refused to give it a spotlight. He believed that most storms can be avoided if you steer early and calmly. For a long time, he was right. There was nothing inevitable about the way his story ended, and that is part of what made it so difficult for people who knew him to process. Yet the end does not erase the middle. The middle is the real story. Years of small choices that prevented bigger ones from being forced. A long bridge between Staten Island and Palermo, walked with the patience of someone who trusts time more than noise. A household managed with the same discipline he asked of others. A public footprint modest enough to look like anyone's. That is why, when people on both sides of the ocean say his name, they lower their voices out of habit, not fear. He taught them to do so by example. If you listen, the city still hums in the key he favored low, even, efficient. A cargo door rolls up at dawn. A meeting ends before lunch. A phone buzzes, and the reply is brief. Somewhere in Palermo, a cousin sets a cup on a saucer and thinks about timing. Somewhere on Staten Island, a porch light clicks on at dusk because it always has. A life like his doesn't leave a soundtrack. It leaves a tempo. Others can keep it, and for now, they do. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Frank Cali here, thanking you for joining me in a story of calm leadership, quiet power, and lasting legacy. If this story helped you unwind tonight, don't forget to like the video, Subscribe and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire watch over your rest, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.